Okay, we're back. It's Mercedes. It's 213B. We're going to talk about self-regulation and emotion regulation. Course objectives: develop an understanding of emotion regulation, positive emotions, and negative emotions, and how they relate to the functioning of adolescence. This is the first of 4 weeks on emotion. And here are our 3 readings this week. We'll do some lecture right now, and we'll open up discussion. Time for reflections later. The first article is Kuhl, 2009. This is our Dutch psychologist, Dr. Sander Kuhl. This is an article on ER, emotion regulation. Emotional regulation is how we manage our emotions. Kuhl calls ER one of the most far-ranging and influential processes at the interface of cognition and emotion. ER has been linked to mental and physical health, relationship satisfaction, and work performance. Related concepts, kind of similar research done in mood regulation, affect regulation, and coping with stress. There has been an explosion of research over about the past 2 decades, and Kuhl speaks to the need to integrate all of this research. So he provides a descriptive framework, as he calls it, for describing different ER strategies, while also saying we need a more systematic and empirical framework. And he says that this review considers literature on healthy adults, and it's from what is relevant within the psychology of ER. Because both external stimuli like gossip and internal stimuli like an upset stomach only occasionally trigger full-blown, kind of high-intensity emotions, we can infer that people engage in some form of emotion regulation almost all of the time. So emotion regulation can be defined as the set of processes whereby people seek to redirect the spontaneous flow of their emotions. Our visual anchor: emotions are like sheep without a shepherd. Emotion regulation is the shepherd. Okay. The article takes an individual focus. So Kuhl says emotion regulation happens by forces outside of the self. This is clearly important, like parents, schools, family structure. Nevertheless, following the predominant focus of the literature, Kuhl concentrates on the self-regulation of emotion. So this is my brother and his baby girl. She regulates her emotions by way of others' influence, like her dad, who burps, bathes, coos, etc. Parent schmerent, system schmistum. We want to understand that there is way more going on than this individual focus, but for the time being, we're going to take this individual focus. We think of ER as a deliberate, effortful process. This is kind of the prototype that seeks to override our spontaneous emotional responses. These processes are similar to systems involved in action and attention, okay? So even though this is what we think of, other forms of emotion regulation are automatic and effortless and do not involve overriding other emotions or any. So in this visual anchor, we are the car. We sometimes use manual drive and sometimes use automatic drive in terms of emotional self-regulation. During emotion regulation, we increase, maintain, or decrease, 3 options, both positive and negative emotions. When we are chronically unable to regulate our emotions, this may seriously disrupt psychological functioning. And this is covered in Carver et al. A little bit. We'll get to it. Chronic defects or deficits in emotion regulation contribute to all major forms of psychopathology. I tried to Google image search for a flock of sheep that had gone haywire, and it would represent our emotions. Without their shepherd, did not get good hits, so that's what I searched for. The effects of emotion regulation can be observed across all modalities of emotional responding, including behavior, physiology, thoughts, and feelings. So this is the famous cognitive triangle that you will likely learn about as you approach your community-based internships. It's all over counseling. It's a very handy CBT tool that helps clients consider different ways to self-regulate and to understand the relationship between what we think, feel, and do. And I use this all the time with my teens anxiety group and in individual work at my high school. Going on, emotional responding appears to be organized in terms of a few fundamental dimensions. So on the screen here you see the dimensions of valence and arousal. There's also approach avoidance, but that's discussed in Carver et al., and we'll get to it later. So here's an illustration of valence times arousal. You see high arousal at the top and low arousal at the bottom, positive to the right and negative to the left. And you see different emotions that are associated with different positions on this matrix. So to determine basic principles of emotion regulation, it's most productive to conceive of emotion regulation broadly. This is what Kuhl says, based on the research, as relating to the management of all emotionally charged states, including discrete emotions, mood, stress, and affect. Even though they are distinct, it's best to conceptualize them kind of together at this point in time. Now I'm going to just take us away from the article for a moment and think about the importance of looking outside of and beyond the individual. When I was an undergrad, I took personality psychology with a certain professor, Tsai, T-S-A-I, who did work on the influence of our ideal affective states, so the way we aspire to feel, and that was different from our actual states in many cases. So Tsai and colleagues have consistently found culturally specific ideal affective states, and the oversimplification may be called low arousal positive and high arousal positive. High arousal positive on the right, a party, it's very American, I would say Western, but let's just focus on, USA, American flag, whatever. And then the low arousal positive, more associated with Eastern cultures and, Chinese, for example. So this, the point is that we should try to be aware in our counseling, in our work, of the targets or affective goals of our work, and be aware of our own biases and how these may play out across the generation times immigration gap. It's kind of getting into cultural ecological theory. But we might have different ideal affective states to be aware of. Okay, this graph took me a while to understand, I must admit, and I pulled it right from the article. It's on page 8. What is the difference between regulated and unregulated emotion? So it's unclear where an emotion ends and regulation begins. So if we look at this, the primary response, according to Kuhl, is our emotional sensitivity. It's the onset of the emotion, what pops up right away. The secondary response is emotional regulation. It's the offset or exit gradient of emotion, and it marks the return to a neutral baseline. The primary emotional response, the onset, may be unwanted and is unregulated. The secondary response, which is emotional regulation, is our controlled process that tries to manage the primary response. So secondary reaction is emotional regulation. Primary reaction is emotional sensitivity. And then downregulation is a steeper exit gradient and a speedier return to baseline. Upregulation is like an intensifier, that which increases the magnitude of the response. Emotion regulation can also occur proactively before anything even happens. So when people are avoiding an upcoming situation that they think is going to elicit an undesired emotion, then emotional sensitivity can happen during the anticipation phase. And emotional regulation, similarly, can happen proactively. Okay? Emotion regulation can also influence other aspects of emotional processing, including, now this is these 4 things. These are the visual anchor. I just used the theme of maps. all related to MAPS. Coherence, how consistent is our emotional story? Intensity, how strongly felt are these emotions? Awareness, our noticing of what we feel. And goal-directedness, kind of the why we feel this way, kind of the operative sense of the emotions. This is all how ER can influence other parts of emotional processing. The awareness one is Christopher Columbus, being disoriented, lacking awareness, so to speak. The goal-directedness one is a treasure map. Intensity is a heat map. Coherence is a map of the United States of America. Okay, so here is where we come in. Emotion sensitivity follows an intrinsic path of development. This is now the sensitivity, the onset of emotion. This path of development is largely independent of environmental influences, and our emotional sensitivity, again the onset, changes less as people grow older. By contrast, competencies in emotion regulation, use of strategies to manage emotions, are strongly influenced by the quality of children's social interactions with their caregivers and their teachers, and soon, expanding that to and their psychologists, and continue to improve even into old age. So across the lifespan, traits related to emotion regulation and traits related to emotional reactivity interact in predicting psychological functioning. This is why it's so important. We can teach emotion regulation strategies, which we will discuss much later, specific strategies, and soon, and we can support folks in their practicing and applying them and noticing when they're practicing and applying them. This comes up a lot in my work in SFUSD.